Blood soaked through the man's shirt and dripped onto the frozen ground, and Marion Chase nearly screamed when her foot struck his outstretched hand in the dark. She had gone out only to check on the goat, lantern swinging, breath fogging in the cold November air, and instead she found a stranger lying face down among the fallen branches at the edge of her land. For one terrible moment she thought he was dead. Then his fingers twitched against the frost, and a low groan escaped his cracked lips. Every instinct told her to run back inside, bolt the door, and pretend she had seen nothing. A wounded man found on her property meant trouble, and trouble was the one thing Marion Chase could not afford. She had a farm to keep, a younger brother to feed, and a name in the village that was already fragile since their father died owing money to half the men in the county. If she was caught helping a criminal, or worse, if he died on her land, she could lose everything, including her freedom. But she knelt beside him anyway. His coat, what remained of it, was fine wool, torn and stained but clearly expensive, the kind no farmhand or thief could ever afford. Beneath the blood on his temple she caught the pale, refined lines of his face, a face that had never known a day of hard labor. Whoever he was, he did not belong on a muddy country road in the middle of the night, bleeding from wounds that looked less like an accident and more like an attack. "Sir," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes opened just enough to show a sliver of gray, unfocused and glassy with pain. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out, and then his head fell back against the earth. Marion looked toward the road, empty, silent, except for the wind moving through the bare trees. But something about the stillness felt wrong, like the quiet after a struck bell, and every hair on her arms rose at once. She could not leave him there. Whatever sense told her to walk away, a stronger and older instinct told her that if she did, he would be dead by morning, and she would spend the rest of her life wondering if she could have stopped it. Getting him inside was its own battle. He was tall, broad through the shoulders despite his leanness, and every part of him seemed to weigh twice what a man his size should. She dragged him by the arms across the frozen yard, her boots slipping in the mud, her lantern abandoned on the ground so she could use both hands. By the time she reached the door of the cottage, her arms burned and her breath came out in ragged white clouds. Her brother Colin was waiting just inside, having heard the commotion. He was 14, all elbows and worry, and his eyes went wide at the sight of the bleeding stranger. "Marion, what happened? Who is that?" "I don't know," she said, pulling the man's shoulders over the threshold. "Help me, quickly, before someone passes on the road." Colin hesitated only a heartbeat before grabbing the man's legs. Together they hauled him inside, and Marion barred the door the instant he was clear of it, her hands trembling as she slid the wooden beam into place. They laid him on the kitchen floor near the hearth, and for the first time, in decent light, Marion saw the full extent of his injuries. A gash along his ribs, deep enough to worry her, bruising across his jaw and knuckles that told her he had fought, and fought hard, before he fell. And beneath the torn shirt, a wound in his shoulder that looked less like a fall and more like a blade had been there. This was not a man who had stumbled off a horse. This was a man who had been hunted. "We should fetch the doctor," Colin said, already moving toward his boots. "No," the word came out sharper than she meant. Colin stared at her, startled, and she softened her voice, though her heart was still hammering. "Think, Colin. Look at his coat, look at his hands, they've never held a plow. A man like this, attacked in the night and left for dead on our land. If we bring the doctor, word will spread before sunrise. Whoever did this to him might come looking to finish what they started, and they'll find him here. Then what do we do?" Marion looked down at the stranger's pale, blood-streaked face, unconscious now, utterly at her mercy, and felt the full weight of the decision settle onto her shoulders. "We hide him," she said, "and we keep him alive." The cellar beneath the cottage was small, dry, and hidden behind a false shelf her father had built years ago to store contraband whiskey during leaner harvests. It was the only place in the house no search would easily find. Marion had never imagined she would use it to hide a man instead of a bottle. Getting him down the narrow steps was agony. Twice she thought they would drop him, and twice Colin caught his weight at the last moment, sweat breaking out on his young face despite the cold. When they finally laid the stranger on the old cot in the corner, Marion sank to her knees beside him, hands shaking as she peeled back his ruined shirt to look at the wound properly. It was worse than she feared. The cut along his ribs needed stitching, and the gash at his shoulder was already swollen and hot beneath her fingers. She had tended enough farm injuries to know what infection looked like, and she had perhaps a single night before this became a fight not against blood loss, but against fever. "Boil water," she told Colin. "Bring the sewing kit, the clean linen, and the willow bark from the shelf. Hurry. He ran without another word, and Marion was left alone with the stranger, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. In the low light of her single candle, she studied his face again. There was something in it, even bloodied and pale, that unsettled her. A kind of bearing, even unconscious, that spoke of command. Whoever he was accustomed to being obeyed and to being protected. Which meant that somewhere out there, someone had failed to protect him, and someone else had wanted him dead. She worked through the night by candlelight, cleaning and stitching the wounds with hands that had grown steadier with practice, murmuring reassurances to a man who could not hear them. Heal one. Colin helped where he could, fetching water, holding cloths, his young face pale with the strain of what they were doing. Near dawn, as the first gray light crept through the small cellar window, the stranger's eyes opened again. This time they found her face and held there, sharp despite the pain, as though he were trying to memorize her. "Where?" he managed, voice hoarse and broken. "Am I?" "Somewhere safe," Marion said, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "For now." He tried to sit up, and the movement clearly cost him, a sharp hiss of pain escaping through clenched teeth. She placed a firm hand on his good shoulder, pushing him gently back down. "Don't, you'll open the stitches. You've lost enough blood already." "You should not," he said, each word an effort, "have brought me inside." "Perhaps not," she agreed. "But I did, so you might as well stop fighting me and let yourself heal." His gray eyes studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind them, somewhere between suspicion and gratitude and something else she could not name. "Who are you?" he asked. "Marion Chase, this is my home. You're in my cellar, and you're going to stay quiet, because if anyone finds you here, we're both in danger." "Danger," he repeated softly, and something like a bitter smile touched his cracked lips. "You have no idea." Before she could ask what he meant, his eyes fluttered shut again, exhaustion and fever pulling him back under. Marion sat beside him in the flickering candlelight, listening to his ragged breathing, and felt a cold certainty settle into her chest. Whoever this man was, whatever had happened to him in the dark woods beyond her farm, it was far from over. And by dragging him through her door, she had made his enemies her own, whether she wanted them or not. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and somewhere in the distance a dog began to bark, sharp and insistent, the kind of bark that meant strangers were near. Marion blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, listening, her heart pounding against her ribs, wondering how long it would be before someone came looking for the man bleeding out in her cellar. She did not have to wait long to find out. The knock came just after sunrise, 3 sharp raps that sent Marion's heart into her throat. She had barely closed her eyes for an hour, still dressed, still smelling of blood and herbs from the long night in the cellar. Colin froze at the table, a bowl of porridge halfway to his mouth, and the two of them stared at each other across the small kitchen, both thinking the same terrified thought. They know. Marion smoothed her skirt, forced her face into something resembling calm, and opened the door only as far as necessity required. 2 men stood in her yard. Neither wore a uniform, but both carried themselves with the hard, watchful posture of men who did violence for a living. The taller one had a scar through one eyebrow and eyes the color of wet slate. He introduced himself as Cyrus Pike, in service to the household of the Earl of Camden, and said they were searching the countryside for a missing man who had run afoul of thieves on the North Road. "A dangerous fellow," Pike said, his tone almost pleasant, though his gaze moved past her shoulder into the cottage with obvious purpose. "Prone to violence, might claim to be someone he isn't, if you understand me. The Earl is most anxious he be found and returned home, for his own safety." "I haven't seen anyone," Marion said, keeping her voice steady. "We keep to ourselves out here." Pike's eyes lingered on her a moment too long, then dropped to her hands, which she realized too late still bore a faint smear of dried blood at the knuckle. She curled her fingers into her palm before he could look closer, but the small movement did not escape him. "Mind if we look around the property?" he asked, already stepping forward. Every part of Marion wanted to refuse, but refusal itself would raise suspicion faster than anything else could. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile. "Though there's little to see. A goat, a henhouse, and my brother's temper if you wake him too early." It was a poor joke, but Pike's companion, a shorter, thicker man with a scar of his own along his jaw, gave a short laugh, and the tension eased just slightly. Marion stood in the doorway, blocking as much of the interior view as she dared, while the 2 men walked the perimeter of the yard, peering into the small barn, kicking at the hay, glancing toward the woods where she had found the stranger the night before. Her stomach twisted into knots the entire time. If they asked to search the house itself, if they thought to look beneath the kitchen floor, everything would be lost in an instant. But whether from luck or from the ordinary appearance of her poor farm, they did not ask. After several long minutes, Pike returned to the doorway, studying her face once more with those pale, assessing eyes. "If you do see him," he said slowly, "a tall man, dark hair, likely wounded, you'd do well to send word to the Camden estate immediately. There's a reward for information. And it would be unwise," he added, his voice dropping just slightly, "to shelter a man like that without knowing what he is." "I understand," Marian said. "Good." Pike touched his hat in a mocking sort of courtesy and turned away, his companion following. Marian watched them walk down the lane toward the neighboring farms, their pace unhurried, as though they had all the time in the world, and no doubt at all that they would find what they were looking for eventually. She did not move from the doorway until they had vanished around the bend, and even then, her legs nearly gave out beneath her. "Marian." Colin's voice was barely a whisper behind her. "They said Earl of Camden, isn't that—" "I know what it is," she said quietly, closing the door and dropping the bar back into place with hands that would not stop shaking. She knew the name well enough. Everyone in the county did. The Camden estate was the grandest for 50 miles, its lands stretching from the river to the hills, its wealth the subject of endless gossip in the village market. But the current holder of the title was not the young duke who had inherited it, but his uncle, who governed as guardian and regent while claiming the duke was too often absent, too often unwell, too unfit to manage his own affairs. Marian had never given the arrangement much thought before. Now, standing with her back against her own front door, she felt the shape of something dark and dangerous beginning to form. A man bleeding out in the woods, a wounded shoulder that looked like a blade, not an accident. An uncle's men searching the roads with a story about thieves and danger, offering a reward, warning her against shelter as though sheltering him were somehow a crime rather than simple mercy. She thought of the stranger's bitter smile the night before, the way he had said "you have no idea" when she spoke of danger. She went down to the cellar at once. He was awake when she pulled back the false shelf, propped against the wall despite the pain it clearly cost him, his gray eyes sharp and alert in a way they had not been hours before. Fever still flushed his cheeks, but awareness had returned, wary and watchful. "I heard voices," he said, "above. 2 men, looking for a missing man who ran afoul of thieves." Marian crossed her arms, studying his face carefully. "Sent from the Camden estate." Something shifted behind his eyes, quick and controlled, but not quick enough to hide from her entirely. Fear, just for an instant, before he mastered it and his expression closed like a shutting door. "You know them," she said. It was not a question. "I know of them," he said carefully. "Don't lie to me." Marian knelt beside the cot, keeping her voice low despite the thickness of the floor above. "I dragged you into my home. I stitched your wounds with my own hands. Those men stood at my door not an hour ago, and if they had thought to search inside, we would both be finished. I have a right to know what I've brought into my house." For a long moment he said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point past her shoulder, as though weighing what to tell her and what to keep buried. Finally he exhaled, slow and rough. "My name," he said, "is not something I can give you yet, not because I do not trust you, because knowing it puts you in greater danger than you already are." "I already sheltered a man those 2 are hunting like game," Marian said. "I think the danger is already here, whether I know your name or not." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement of the truth in her words. "Fair enough." He shifted, wincing, one hand pressing lightly against the bandage at his ribs. "What I can tell you is this. I did not run afoul of thieves. I was attacked, deliberately, by men sent to make certain I did not survive the night. The story your visitors gave you is a lie built to make my death look like misfortune, should they find and finish what they started. Who would want you dead?" "Someone," he said quietly, "who benefits greatly from my absence. Someone with far more men, far more money, and far more patience than either of us can afford to underestimate." Marian sat back on her heels, the pieces settling into a shape she did not like at all. "The Earl of Camden." He did not answer. He did not need to. The silence itself was confirmation enough, and Marian felt the cold certainty of it settle deep into her bones. "You're the Duke," she said slowly. "The one they say is too unwell to hold his own title." His gray eyes met hers, steady, despite the fever still burning beneath his skin, and something in his expression was almost an apology. "I am considerably more well than my uncle would prefer," he said. Which is precisely why he has spent the last 2 years trying to arrange my death in ways that could never be traced back to him. Last night, he came closer than he ever has before. Marion pressed a hand to her mouth, understanding at last the full size of what she had pulled through her own front door. This was not simply a wounded stranger. This was the missing heir to one of the greatest fortunes in the country, hunted by his own blood, hidden now beneath her kitchen floor while the men sent to kill him walked her own lane in broad daylight, close enough that she could still hear the faint echo of their boots if she closed her eyes. "If they find you here," she whispered, "they won't just kill you." "No," he agreed grimly. "They will make certain there are no witnesses left to speak of it, which is why you should have let me lie in those woods, Miss Chase, and saved yourself a great deal of trouble." Marion looked at him for a long moment, at the fever-bright eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw even now, weakened and hunted and utterly at her mercy, and felt something stir in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite pity, but something stronger than both. "It's a bit late for that particular regret," she said, rising to her feet. "You're in my cellar. You're going to heal, and we are going to find a way to keep both our heads attached to our shoulders in the meantime." For the first time since she had found him bleeding in the frost, something that might have been a real smile touched his mouth. "You are either very brave," he said, "or very foolish." "In my experience," Marion said, moving toward the stairs, "it is rarely easy to tell the difference, until it is far too late to matter." She left him there in the dim cellar light, climbing back up into her kitchen where Colin waited with wide, frightened eyes, and outside, somewhere beyond the hedgerow, the distant sound of hoofbeats told her that Cyrus Pike and his companion had not yet finished their search of the county, and would not finish it for a long while yet. 3 days passed before the Duke could sit upright without his vision swimming, and in that time, Marion Chase learned more about fear than she had in the whole of her 23 years. Every creak of the front gate sent her heart into her throat. Every dog barking in the distance made her hands tremble around whatever task occupied them. She had grown so accustomed to a quiet, predictable life, the rhythms of the farm, the market on Thursdays, the small comforts of a home free from complication, and now every hour carried the weight of a held breath, waiting for the moment it would all come crashing down. He had told her his name on the second night, when fever loosened his usual careful guard and honesty slipped out before he could stop it. "Julian," he murmured, half asleep, when she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "Julian Rourke. Not that it will matter, when they find me." She had said nothing at the time, only continued her work. But the name settled into her like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood about her own quiet life. Julian Rourke, Duke of Camden. A name spoken with reverence and pity in every market stall and church pew for 2 counties around, the tragic young Duke lost to illness and misfortune, managed so carefully by his devoted uncle, that no one ever thought to ask why he was never seen, never heard from, never present at his own estate. Now she understood. He had not been managed. He had been imprisoned in slow, patient increments, isolated and undermined until the moment his uncle judged it safe to finish the work entirely. On the 3rd day, with the fever finally broken and his strength beginning, however slowly, to return, Julian insisted on hearing the full truth of her situation, in exchange for the truth he had given her. "You risk your life sheltering me," he said, sitting up against the cellar wall with visible effort, his color better than it had been but still far from healthy. "The least you deserve is to understand exactly what that risk means." Marion sat across from him on an overturned crate, a bowl of broth between them that he had eaten only half of, too proud or too stubborn to admit how much the effort of lifting a spoon still cost him. "My uncle's name is Bertram Ellery," Julian said. "My mother's brother. When my father died, I was barely of age, and the estate required a guardian until I came fully into my majority. Bertram was the obvious choice, trusted, capable, beloved by the tenants. For the first year, I believed everything he told me, that I was unwell, that I needed rest, quiet, distance from the burdens of the title. I did not question it, because I trusted him. When did that change? When I began to notice how carefully my letters were controlled, how few visitors were permitted to see me, how every physician he brought to examine me prescribed the same treatments that made me weaker rather than stronger." Julian's jaw tightened, old anger surfacing beneath the calm of his telling. "By the time I understood what was happening, I was already isolated enough that escaping seemed impossible. 3 months ago, I finally managed it, with help from a groom in the stables who risked everything to see me safely off the estate grounds." "Neil," Marion said, remembering the name he had mentioned in passing the day before. "Neil Sanders." If he still lives, he is the only person besides you who knows I survived that night my uncle's men caught up with me in the woods. Julian's gray eyes darkened. I do not know what became of him. I can only hope my uncle's fury landed on me rather than him. Marian absorbed this in silence, turning the broth spoon slowly between her fingers. Why now? Why did he wait so long, if he wanted you gone from the start? Because as long as I remained his ward, incapable and unwell, he controlled everything without the risk of murder hanging over him. But I turned 25 last month. A humorless smile crossed his face. The terms of my father's will require me to formally reclaim full control of the estate at 25. In person, before witnesses, or the guardianship becomes permanent under law. My uncle could not risk that ceremony taking place, so he decided it was time I disappeared instead. The full shape of it settled over Marian like a shadow crossing the sun. This was not simply a family quarrel or a dispute over money. This was a calculated, patient plan to erase a man entirely, to steal not just a fortune but an entire life, and she had waded directly into the middle of it with nothing more than a lantern and a foolish, stubborn conscience that would not let her walk past a dying man in the frost. There must be something that can be done, she said. Some way to prove who you are, to bring this before a magistrate. There is. Julian's expression turned grim, but it requires reaching Camden Hall itself, or at least reaching someone of standing who will believe my claim over my uncle's, and doing so before he learns I survived and adjusts his plans accordingly. Every day I remain hidden is a day closer to him tightening his search, widening the net, until eventually it catches me regardless of how carefully you hide me. Then we plan, Marian said simply. You are in no condition to travel anywhere tonight, or for several nights yet. So we use the time, we think. Julian studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gaze. Gratitude tangled together with something warmer and far more dangerous than gratitude alone. You keep saying we, he said quietly. As though this is your fight as much as mine. It became my fight the moment I dragged you through my door, Marian said, meeting his eyes without flinching. I don't regret it, but don't mistake me for someone who does things by half measures. If I'm in this, I'm in it fully, whatever that costs. Something shifted in his expression then, and for a moment the careful, guarded distance between them thinned to almost nothing. You barely know me, he said. I know enough, Marian answered. I know a man who could have let his uncle's lies stand, who could have simply vanished quietly and let the theft happen without a fight, but chose instead to escape, to run, to survive against every possible odds, because some part of him refused to accept the injustice of it. That tells me a great deal more than a title ever could. The silence that followed was different from the fearful, watchful silence of the past days. It was warmer, weighted with something neither of them named aloud, and Marian felt her own pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear of discovery. She rose before the moment could stretch further, gathering the empty bowl, needing the small physical task to steady herself against feelings she had no business entertaining for a man so far above her station. A man who, if he survived this, would return to a life of wealth and title, utterly beyond her small farm, and her brother's schooling, and her father's unpaid debts. But as she climbed the cellar stairs, she could feel his eyes on her back the entire way, and she knew, with a certainty that unsettled her more than any search party ever could, that whatever this was becoming between them, it had already grown too large to simply walk away from. Above, in the kitchen, Colin sat at the table with a slate and chalk, practicing his letters as though the world had not tilted entirely sideways around them. He looked up when she entered, his young face far too serious for a boy his age. Is he going to be all right? Colin asked. He's healing, Marian said, setting down the bowl, slowly. And after that? When he's strong enough to leave, what happens to us? Will those men come back? It was the question Marian had been avoiding asking herself, and hearing it from her brother's mouth made it impossible to avoid any longer. She sat across from him, taking his small, chalk-stained hand in hers. I don't know, she admitted honestly. But I know we cannot simply hand him over to men who mean to kill him, whatever the risk to us. That is not the kind of people we are, Colin. Whatever father's debts left us, whatever hardship we've faced, we do not become people who turn their backs on someone in need because it is convenient. Colin nodded slowly, though worry still clouded his young eyes. Father would have said the same thing. Father would have said exactly the same thing, Marian agreed, squeezing his hand. That night, after Colin had gone to sleep and the house had settled into its usual watchful quiet, Marian found herself once more descending the cellar stairs, telling herself it was simply to check on the wound, to ensure the fever had not returned, to perform the ordinary duties of a caretaker, and nothing more. Julian was awake, sitting up against the wall with a strength that had noticeably improved even in the space of a single day, his gray eyes finding hers the moment the candlelight spilled down the stairs. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you." "I've had quite enough sleep to last me a lifetime," he said dryly, gesturing at the cot. 3 days of forced rest tends to have that effect. Marian allowed herself a small smile, crossing to sit on the crate beside him, close enough now that she could see the details of his face clearly in the low light. The sharp line of his jaw softened slightly by the ordeal of the past days, the faint scar above one eyebrow, old and pale, some earlier mark of a life she knew almost nothing about, the steady, watchful intelligence in his eyes that no amount of fever or weakness had ever fully dimmed. "Tell me something true," she said, "not about your uncle, or the estate, or the danger outside, something true about you." He considered this for a long moment, as though the request itself were somehow more difficult than confessing the entirety of his family's betrayal had been. "I used to want none of it," he said finally. "The title, the estate, all of it. As a boy, I envied the sons of my father's stewards, who could run wild through the fields without a tutor trailing behind them, who were never expected to sit through hours of ledgers and inheritance law before they had even finished growing." A faint, rueful smile touched his mouth. "I would have traded every acre of Camden land for a single unremarkable day, like the ones you must have had, running a farm, answering to no one but yourself and your own conscience." "Careful," Marian said softly. "Unremarkable days have their own difficulties. Debts, empty larders in winter, a younger brother who asks questions I don't always know how to answer." "Perhaps," Julian said, his gaze steady on hers, "but you face those difficulties with your own hands, your own choices. No one controls your letters. No one decides what physicians you may see, or what truths you're permitted to know about your own life. There is a freedom in that, Miss Chase, that I have only fully understood since I lost it." The space between them felt suddenly very small, the candlelight throwing soft shadows across both their faces, and Marian was acutely aware of how close he sat, of the warmth radiating from him despite the cold of the cellar, of the way his eyes had not once left hers since she sat down. "When this is over," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, "when you've reclaimed everything that's yours, you'll return to that world. The ledgers, the estate, the title. This," she gestured vaguely at the small cellar, the crate, the flickering candle, "will simply be a strange chapter you survived." "Will it?" Julian asked, something low and serious in his voice that made her breath catch. "I confess I find that difficult to imagine, Miss Chase. I do not think I will forget easily the woman who chose to risk everything for a stranger bleeding in the frost, who has sat beside me every night since asking nothing in return but honesty." Marian did not trust herself to answer that, not with the warmth spreading through her chest, and the dangerous, foolish hope beginning to bloom despite every practical instinct warning her against it. She rose instead, murmuring something about the hour, about needing rest before the morning chores, and Julian let her go without protest, though his eyes followed her all the way up the stairs. She lay awake long after, listening to the wind outside and the quiet, even breathing of her brother in the next room, and thought of gray eyes and careful honesty and a danger that had, somehow, without her fully realizing it, become tangled together with something that felt very much like the beginning of falling in love. Outside, far down the lane, a lantern moved slowly through the darkness, pausing at each farmhouse gate in turn, drawing steadily, patiently closer to her own. The lantern light Marian had glimpsed the night before belonged, she learned by morning, to Cyrus Pike himself, who had taken to walking the lanes after dark, questioning any soul unfortunate enough to be caught outside after sunset. By the time she heard the news from a neighbor at the well, her hands had gone cold with dread, and she hurried home faster than she had walked in years. The search, it seemed, was narrowing. 2 more farms had been questioned that week, their barns searched, their cellars checked, their household staff pressed for information about strangers, wounded men, anything unusual in the recent days. So far, luck and the modesty of her own small holding had spared her a second visit, but Marian understood with grim clarity that luck alone would not hold forever. Pike was thorough and patient, and clearly under considerable pressure from his employer to produce results. She relayed this to Julian that evening, watching the muscles in his jaw tighten as she spoke. "They're getting closer," he said, more to himself than to her, "which means it's time I left." "You can barely stand upright for more than a few minutes," Marian said, crossing her arms. "You'll collapse before you reach the end of the lane." And then they'll find you regardless, only weaker and further from any help. And if I stay, they'll find me here, in your cellar, with your brother upstairs, and both of you will be treated as accomplices to whatever crime my uncle decides to invent for me." His gray eyes, sharper now with returning strength, held hers with fierce insistence. "I will not be the reason harm comes to either of you. I've caused enough damage to people who tried to help me already." "Neil Sanders," Marion said quietly, understanding the shadow that crossed his face. "I don't know if he's alive or dead," Julian admitted, his voice rough. "I left him behind at the estate gates, trusting he could slip back to his duties unnoticed. If my uncle discovered his part in my escape, I cannot imagine he showed mercy." "All the more reason to finish this properly," Marion said, sitting beside him despite his obvious frustration. "Not by fleeing half-healed into the arms of the men hunting you, but by growing strong enough to actually win. Running now accomplishes nothing except giving your uncle exactly what he wants, your death, only slightly delayed and considerably more convenient for him to arrange a second time." Julian's jaw worked silently for a long moment, torn between the practical truth of her words and the deep, restless guilt clearly eating at him. Finally, he exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "You argue like a barrister," he muttered. "I argue like someone with more sense than pride," Marion corrected. "A trait I'd suggest you consider adopting, Your Grace." The title, spoken half in jest, seemed to land oddly between them, a reminder of the enormous gulf that separated a duke from a farmer's daughter, however close the cellar walls had drawn them these past days. Julian's expression flickered, something complicated passing behind his eyes. "Please don't call me that," he said quietly. "Not here, not with you." "What should I call you then?" "Julian," he said, "just Julian. I've had precious little of simply being a man these past 2 years, rather than a title to be managed or eliminated. I find I rather prefer it, whatever that says about me." Marion held his gaze a moment longer than was strictly wise, something warm and dangerous unfurling in her chest again. "Julian, then," she agreed softly. The knock came 3 days later, in the middle of the afternoon, while Marion was elbow-deep in laundry, and Colin was out tending the goat. She froze at the sound, her wet hands dripping onto the floor, every instinct screaming that this was different from Pike's first casual visit. This was purposeful, urgent, the knock of a man who suspected something rather than merely gathering information. She dried her hands quickly and opened the door to find Cyrus Pike alone this time, his expression harder than before, his eyes moving past her into the cottage with unmistakable intent. "Miss Chase," he said without preamble, "I'll be direct with you. We've had word from a neighboring farm of a young woman seen dragging a heavy weight toward her cottage the very night our missing man went missing. Description matched your farm rather precisely." Marion's stomach dropped, ice flooding through her veins, but she kept her face as still as she could manage. "I don't know what you mean. I was inside that night, same as any other." "Mind if I look inside properly this time?" Pike asked, already stepping forward, his tone leaving no real room for refusal. Just to put the matter to rest. There was no plausible way to deny him without confirming exactly the suspicion he already carried. Marion's mind raced through every possibility, every excuse, and found none of them sufficient. She stepped back from the door, forcing what she hoped looked like mild irritation rather than the sheer terror clawing up her throat. "As you like," she said. "Though you'll find nothing but laundry and a poor woman's household, same as before." Pike moved through the small cottage with methodical thoroughness, checking beneath the bed, inside the small pantry, behind the modest furniture that made up her entire household. Marion followed close behind, her heart hammering so loudly she feared he might hear it, praying with everything in her that Julian, warned somehow by the sound of the knock, had managed to conceal himself properly behind the false shelf. When Pike's boots found the kitchen floor and paused above the trapdoor to the cellar, Marion felt her entire body go cold. "What's below?" he asked. "Root cellar," Marion said, proud of how steady her voice remained despite the roaring in her ears. "Potatoes, turnips, whatever we've managed to store for winter. Careful of the steps, they're none too sturdy." Pike studied her face for a long moment, searching for any crack in her composure, and Marion held his gaze without flinching, though every part of her wanted to scream, to run, to do anything except stand still while he decided whether to descend those stairs and end everything in a single discovery. Finally, mercifully, he stepped back from the trapdoor. "Another time, perhaps," he said, his tone carrying an edge that told her this was not truly finished, merely postponed. "The Earl grows impatient, Miss Chase. And impatient men have a way of making unfortunate assumptions about those who seem overly protective of their privacy. "I've nothing to hide," Marion said, beyond a poor widow's worry for her humble home. Pike's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "We'll see." He turned toward the door, pausing once more at the threshold. "If you hear anything, see anything, I'd advise coming forward promptly. The reward grows larger by the day, and my patience," his eyes flicked once more toward the trapdoor, "grows correspondingly shorter." He left without further ceremony, and Marion barred the door behind him with hands that shook so violently she nearly dropped the wooden beam entirely. She sank against the door, breath coming in ragged gasps, the full terror of the past several minutes finally crashing over her now that the danger had passed. She went straight to the cellar the moment she trusted her legs to carry her. Julian was pressed flat behind the false shelf where the whiskey once hid, barely breathing, his face pale with the effort of remaining perfectly silent through the entire ordeal. When Marion pulled the shelf aside, he emerged slowly, and the moment their eyes met, something raw and shaken passed between them, the shared aftermath of a danger survived by the narrowest margin either of them cared to imagine. "That was too close," Marion whispered. "Far too close," Julian agreed, his voice unsteady. He reached out, almost without thinking, and took her trembling hand in his own, steadying them both with the simple contact. "Marion, I cannot let this continue." If he had gone down those stairs. "He didn't," she said, though her voice shook as badly as his. "He nearly did, and next time, or the time after, he will." Julian's grip on her hand tightened, his gray eyes fierce with a determination that frightened her nearly as much as Pike's visit had. "I won't let you and your brother pay the price for my survival. I would rather face my uncle's men in open ground than watch that happen. And I would rather you stayed alive long enough to actually defeat him," Marion said, "than throw yourself at his men out of some misguided sense of protecting me. We are past the point where either of us can pretend this danger is separate, Julian. It became shared the moment I pulled you through my door, and it will remain shared until this is finished, one way or another." His eyes searched hers for a long moment, something fierce and tender warring behind the gray, and then, before either of them fully decided to allow it, he closed the small distance between them and pressed his forehead gently against hers, a gesture more intimate than words, both of them still trembling from how close disaster had come. "I am not accustomed," he said quietly, "to allowing anyone to share my burdens. It has never been safe to do so." "Then perhaps," Marion said softly, "it's time you learned differently." Neither of them moved for a long moment, the small cellar suddenly feeling far too warm despite the winter chill beyond its walls, and Marion was acutely, dangerously aware of how little distance remained between them, of the steady warmth of his hand still wrapped around hers, of the low, unsteady rhythm of his breathing so close to her own. It was Colin's voice calling from above, returning from the goat pen, that finally broke the moment, and both of them stepped back with something like reluctant relief, the ordinary world reasserting itself around the extraordinary danger they had just survived. But as Marion climbed the cellar stairs once more, her hand still tingling faintly where his fingers had held it, she understood with unshakable certainty that whatever remained of Pike's search, whatever danger still lay ahead, she was no longer simply protecting a wounded stranger out of stubborn conscience. She was protecting a man she had, somewhere in the space of a handful of desperate days, come to care for far more deeply than any sense of caution should have allowed. And outside her window, the search continued, patient and relentless, drawing steadily, inevitably closer. 5 days after Pike's second visit, a figure appeared at the edge of Marion's property just after dusk, moving with the careful, halting gait of a man who had traveled a long way on foot and paid dearly for it. Colin spotted him first, from the small window facing the lane, and called Marion with a voice tight with alarm. She grabbed the heavy fire poker from beside the hearth before approaching the door, her heart pounding with the certainty that Pike had finally run out of patience. But the man who stood swaying in her yard was not Pike, nor any hired enforcer of the Earls. He was younger, dressed in the plain clothes of a groom, his face bruised and swollen, one arm cradled awkwardly against his ribs, and when his eyes found Marion in the doorway, something like desperate hope broke across his battered features. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm looking for my master. Tall man, dark hair, gray eyes. I was told, by a farmer 3 miles back who saw the state I was in and took pity, that a young woman near here found a wounded stranger in the woods some weeks past. I've searched every farm between here and the river. Please, if you know anything." "Neil," Marion breathed, understanding all at once. Neil Sanders. Relief and disbelief warred across his exhausted face. You know my name. Then he's alive. He made it. Please, I beg you, let me see him. I've come so far. I thought surely he was dead. I thought. Marion pulled him inside without further hesitation, barring the door swiftly behind him, and called down to the cellar before Neil had even finished catching his breath. Julian appeared at the top of the stairs moments later, and the sight of his groom, battered but alive, standing in Marion's kitchen, brought a raw, unguarded emotion to his face that Marion had not seen from him even in his most vulnerable fevered moments. Neil, Julian said, crossing the room in 3 quick strides despite his still healing wounds, gripping the younger man's good shoulder with something between relief and disbelief. I thought my uncle had killed you for helping me. He nearly did, Neil said grimly, wincing as Julian's grip found a bruise. 2 of his men caught me the morning after you escaped, beat me within an inch of my life demanding to know where you'd gone. I gave them nothing, Your Grace, I swear it, though I confess there were moments I thought I wouldn't survive the questioning to keep that promise. How did you get away? Marion asked, guiding him toward a chair at the table. They locked me in the old grain store, meaning to finish the matter once the Earl decided what story to tell about my disappearance, Neil said, sinking gratefully into the offered seat. But the lock was old, and I've spent half my life around that estate. I know every weak board and rusted hinge on the property. Took me the better part of a week to work the door loose without alerting the guard outside, and another week walking, avoiding the main roads, asking careful questions at each farm I passed. You could have died, Julian said quietly, guilt heavy in his voice. You very nearly did, because of me. I made my own choice that night at the gates, same as I'd make it again, Neil said firmly. You did not ask me to help you escape, Your Grace. I offered, because what your uncle has done to you these past years was wrong, and I could not stand by and watch it continue while pretending otherwise. He looked between Julian and Marion, understanding dawning slowly on his exhausted face. You've been hiding him here this whole time. With considerable risk to us both, Marion said. Pike very nearly found him 5 days past. Neil's expression darkened. Then you understand the situation has grown far more dangerous than even that near miss suggests. While I was still on the estate grounds, before my escape, I overheard the Earl speaking with his solicitor. He means to have Your Grace declared legally dead within the month, using false witness testimony and a body he intends to purchase from the physician who's been falsifying your treatments these past years. Once that declaration is filed and accepted by the courts, the estate passes to him permanently, and even should you reappear afterward, it would take years of costly legal battle to reverse. Years during which he would have every resource of Camden Hall at his disposal to ensure you never survive long enough to see it through. The color drained from Julian's face. A month. He means to move that quickly? Sooner. If his search here proves fruitless much longer, Neil said grimly. He's growing desperate, Your Grace. Desperate men make dangerous mistakes, but they also make dangerous decisions, and I fear he's approaching both in equal measure. Marion felt the weight of the timeline settle heavily over the small kitchen. A month, perhaps less, before Julian's own uncle formally erased his existence from the world, backed by forged evidence and purchased silence, leaving them no path to justice even should Julian survive the immediate danger of discovery. Then we cannot simply wait for you to heal fully and hope for the best, she said slowly, thinking aloud. We need to act, and act soon, before this false declaration can be filed. Act how? Julian asked. I have no proof beyond my own word, which my uncle has spent 2 years carefully undermining with tales of illness and instability. Any magistrate would be more inclined to believe the Earl of Camden over a wounded stranger, with no witnesses beyond a farmer's daughter and a groom already accused of aiding his escape. Not any witnesses beyond us, Neil said slowly, an idea visibly forming behind his tired eyes. But there is Dr. Halden, the physician your uncle has been paying to falsify your treatments. He's grown uneasy these past months, Your Grace. I heard it in his voice more than once when he thought no one listened. If he could be persuaded to testify honestly, to admit the falsified diagnoses and the planned deception with the purchased body, that alone might be enough to turn a magistrate's ear in your favor. Persuading a man who has profited from the Earl's schemes to suddenly risk everything by confessing seems a rather large hope to build a plan around, Marion said doubtfully. Perhaps, Neil admitted. But desperate, guilty men sometimes welcome the chance to unburden themselves, particularly when shown a path that doesn't end with them hanging alongside their employer. Julian paced the small kitchen slowly, favoring his healing side, his mind clearly working through the tangled possibilities. There is also Justice Kemp in the county seat, My father held him in high regard, appointed him to his position personally, and unlike many of my uncle's dealings, that appointment predates his guardianship entirely. If we could reach Kemp directly, present enough evidence to warrant a formal inquiry before my uncle can file his false declaration, it might be enough to force the matter into proper legal channels, where forged evidence becomes considerably harder to maintain under real scrutiny. Then that becomes the plan, Marion said, feeling a fragile thread of hope beginning to weave through the fear that had dominated the past weeks. Reach Dr. Halden, convince him to speak truthfully. Reach Justice Kemp, present enough evidence to force an inquiry. Do both before your uncle can file whatever false declaration he's preparing. It will not be simple, Julian warned. My uncle will have men watching both the physician's home and any road leading toward the county seat, particularly once he realizes his search here has failed to produce results. Every step of this plan carries enormous risk. Every step we've already taken has carried enormous risk, Marion pointed out. I don't see that changing regardless of which direction we choose. Better to face that risk moving toward justice than simply waiting here for your uncle's men to eventually find what they're searching for. Julian studied her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful passing behind his gray eyes. You keep insisting on saying we, Miss Chase, as though your part in this ends anywhere short of standing beside me through whatever comes next. Because it doesn't, Marion said simply. I told you before, I don't do things by half measures. I'm in this until it's finished, one way or the other. And I'd thank you to stop trying to talk me out of it. Neil looked between the two of them, something knowing and faintly amused crossing his exhausted face despite the gravity of their conversation. But he said nothing beyond a small nod, understanding perhaps more than either of them realized about the bond that had grown between them these past weeks in the small cellar below the kitchen floor. They spent the following days in careful, quiet preparation. Julian's strength continued returning, slowly but steadily, enough that he could move without the sharp hitches of pain that had marked his first days in Marion's care. Neil, once his own injuries had eased somewhat, slipped out under cover of darkness to gather what information he could about Pike's continued search and about Dr. Halden's current state of mind, careful never to approach directly, keeping always to the shadows and back paths that had served him well on his long walk to find his master. Marion, for her part, found herself drawn again and again to the small cellar in the quiet hours after Colin had gone to sleep, ostensibly to discuss the unfolding plan, though the conversations often drifted far from strategy into quieter, more personal territory. She learned of Julian's childhood before his father's death, of a mother who had died when he was young, of the strange, isolating weight of a title that had made genuine friendship difficult even before his uncle's betrayal isolated him entirely. In turn, she found herself sharing pieces of her own life she had rarely spoken aloud to anyone. The slow accumulation of her father's debts, the fear of losing the only home she and Colin had left, the quiet loneliness of carrying every burden alone since her father's death with no one to share the weight. You've never once, in all these weeks, asked what you might gain from helping me, Julian observed one evening, watching her across the candlelit cellar with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Most in your position would have considered the reward my uncle offers, or the gratitude a restored duke might show his rescuer, long before now. I've thought of neither, Marion admitted honestly. I helped you because leaving you to die in the frost was never truly a choice I could make and still live with myself afterward. Whatever comes after, whatever reward or gratitude or consequence, that was never the reason. I know, Julian said quietly. That is precisely why it matters so much to me now. The moment stretched between them, warm and fragile, and Marion felt the familiar, dangerous pull toward him that had been building steadily since that first terrified night in the frost. But before either of them could act on it, Neil's urgent footsteps sounded on the cellar stairs, and both of them turned, the intimacy of the moment giving way instantly to the ever-present tension of their circumstances. Pike's men are questioning the physician's household directly, Neil reported, breathless from his careful, hurried journey back. Word in the village says Dr. Halden has grown so nervous under the questioning that he's confined himself to his house, refusing visitors entirely. If we don't reach him soon, either the Earl's suspicion will silence him permanently, or his nerve will simply break and he'll confess everything to Pike instead of to us, which would end this plan before it ever truly began. Julian rose immediately, the last traces of illness falling away beneath sudden, sharp resolve. Then we move tomorrow night. No more waiting, no more preparation. We reach Dr. Halden before my uncle's growing desperation makes that impossible. Marion rose beside him, her own resolve hardening to match his. Then we move together, she said, all of us. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of hoofbeats along the lane, patient and searching still, and somewhere beyond the hills, in the grand halls of Camden Hall, Bertram Ellery was drafting the final language of a declaration that would erase his nephew from the world entirely, unaware that the very night was already turning against him. They left the following night under a sky heavy with cloud, no moon to betray their movement across the fields, only the faint glow of Neil's shielded lantern to guide them along paths he knew from years of quiet errands across the county. Colin had wanted desperately to come, but Marian had insisted he remain behind, hidden at a trusted neighbor's farm where the elderly widow who lived there had agreed, for a small sum and no questions asked, to keep him safe until word came of what had happened. The farewell had been brief and fierce, Colin gripping her hands with a strength that spoke of fear he was trying hard not to show. "Come back," he had said simply, and Marian had promised, though the promise felt fragile even as she made it, given everything that still lay ahead. The journey to Dr. Halden's home on the edge of the county seat took most of the night, moving carefully along back paths and through sleeping farmland, avoiding the main road where Pike's searchers were most likely to patrol. Julian moved slower than his companions would have liked. His strength returned but not yet fully restored, and twice they paused in the shelter of hedgerows while distant riders passed along the road, hearts pounding until the hoofbeats faded once more into silence. They reached the physician's modest house just before dawn, and Neil, familiar with the property from previous errands on the Earl's behalf, guided them to a side entrance rather than risk the front door where a watcher might easily observe unfamiliar visitors. Dr. Halden himself answered their careful knock, and the moment he saw Julian standing pale but very much alive on his doorstep, the color drained entirely from the physician's face. "Your Grace," he whispered, stumbling back a step. "You're meant to be dead. I heard. The search. Everyone believed." "I am very much alive, Doctor," Julian said quietly. "No thanks to my uncle's efforts, and I believe you know precisely why he wished otherwise." Halden's hands trembled visibly as he ushered them inside, glancing anxiously toward the street before securing the door behind them. In the dim light of his modest sitting room, the physician sank into a chair, looking suddenly far older than his years, the weight of guilt plain across his face. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice breaking. "When the Earl first approached me, 2 years past, he spoke only of managing a difficult, melancholic young man for his own protection. I believed it, truly, for the first several months. It was only gradually that I understood the treatments I prescribed were designed to weaken rather than heal, that the isolation I recommended served purposes far darker than any physician's care should ever serve." "Why did you continue, once you understood?" Marian asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "Because by then I was already trapped," Halden said miserably. "The Earl made clear, in ways subtle enough to leave no evidence but unmistakable enough to understand, that my own ruin, perhaps worse, would follow any attempt to withdraw or expose what I had already done. I told myself I was protecting my own family. I told myself many things these past months, none of which I now believe were ever truly honest." "And the body," Julian said, his voice hard, "the one my uncle intends to purchase, to support a false declaration of my death. Do you know of this?" Halden's face went ashen. "I refused that particular request," he said quickly. "Whatever else I've done, I could not bring myself to participate in such a grotesque deception. The Earl grew furious when I declined, threatened me directly for the first time since our arrangement began. I've been waiting, these past weeks, for some manner of retribution to fall, though I confess I did not expect it to arrive in the form of your own survival, Your Grace." "Then you'll testify," Neil said, leaning forward with urgent intensity, "before Justice Kemp, under oath, to everything you've just told us. The falsified treatments, the isolation, the Earl's request regarding the body, all of it." Halden hesitated, old fear warring visibly with the guilt that had clearly been eating at him for months. "If I testify, the Earl will destroy me. My practice, my family's standing, perhaps far worse than mere ruin, given what he's already proven capable of." "If you do not testify," Julian said quietly, "he will succeed in erasing me from existence entirely, and every wrong you've already participated in, however reluctantly, will simply continue unchecked, likely repeated against whatever unfortunate soul stands next in his way. I understand your fear, Doctor. I have lived within it for 2 years myself. But there comes a point where continued silence becomes its own form of guilt, regardless of how it began." The physician's shoulders sagged, some final resistance breaking beneath the weight of Julian's words. "You're right," he said quietly. "God help me. You're right. I'll testify, whatever the cost." They reached the county seat, and Justice Kemp's residence just as the sun climbed fully above the horizon, exhaustion weighing heavily on all of them after the long, tense night of travel. Kemp, An elderly man with sharp, discerning eyes that had clearly seen decades of both honest grief and clever deception paraded before his bench, listened to their combined testimony with grave, careful attention, questioning each of them in turn with the precise thoroughness of a man determined to separate truth from convenient fabrication. "This is a serious accusation," Kemp said finally, once the full account had been laid before him. Dr. Halden's trembling confirmation of the falsified treatments, and the request regarding the body adding weight that Julian's word alone could never have carried. The Earl of Camden is a man of considerable standing in this county. An accusation of this magnitude, without overwhelming evidence, risks considerable consequence should it prove unfounded. "I understand the risk, Justice Kemp," Julian said steadily, "but I would ask you to consider this. My uncle has spent 2 years systematically isolating me, falsifying evidence of illness through a physician now willing to testify to that falsification under oath, and stands prepared, within a matter of weeks, to file a declaration of my death supported by a purchased body, precisely to avoid the legal reckoning my father's will requires at my 25th year. Every piece of that account can be verified, given proper investigation, and I would rather face whatever scrutiny that investigation requires than continue living as a man erased from his own existence." Kemp studied him for a long, weighing moment, then turned his sharp gaze toward Marian. "And your role in this, Miss Chase? What compelled a farmer's daughter to risk such danger sheltering a stranger of this standing?" "I found a dying man in the frost, Justice Kemp," Marian said simply. "I did what I believe any person of conscience would have done in my place. Everything that followed grew from that single decision, and I do not regret a moment of it, whatever the consequence to myself." Something in her steady, unflinching honesty seemed to settle the matter for the old magistrate more thoroughly than any legal argument could have. He rose slowly from his chair, moving to the window, looking out over the county seat with its familiar rooftops and church spire for a long, contemplative moment, before turning back to face them. "I will summon the Earl of Camden to answer these accusations formally," he said finally, "before witnesses, with full opportunity to respond to the evidence presented. If your account proves true, Your Grace, and I confess the physician's testimony carries considerable weight toward that conclusion, your uncle will face the full consequence the law provides for such a scheme, and your rightful inheritance will be restored to you without further obstruction." The formal summons went out that very afternoon, and word of the accusation spread through the county with the swift, unstoppable momentum of scandal too large to contain. By the following morning, when Bertram Ellery arrived at the courthouse, summoned by a magistrate he could not easily ignore without confirming every suspicion against him, a considerable crowd had already gathered, drawn by rumor and disbelief in equal measure. Marian watched from beside Julian as his uncle entered the chamber, a tall, silver-haired man whose composed, dignified bearing gave no outward hint of the ruthless scheme beneath it. Bertram's eyes found his nephew across the room, and for just an instant, something cold and calculating flickered behind his carefully maintained expression, before smooth denial replaced it entirely. "Julian," he said, his voice pitched perfectly for the watching crowd, warm with apparent relief. "Thank heaven you're alive. We feared the worst. Given your unfortunate condition and sudden disappearance, I've spent every resource searching for you, desperate to see you safely returned home." "You spent every resource ensuring I would never be found alive," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, steady, despite the visible tension in his shoulders. "Dr. Halden has already testified to the falsified treatments you commissioned these past 2 years, and to your explicit request regarding a body to support a false declaration of my death. Deny it as you wish, Uncle, but the evidence already stands against you." A murmur swept through the gathered crowd, and Bertram's composed mask cracked visibly for the first time, cold fury flashing briefly across his refined features before he mastered it once more. "Lies," he said sharply, spun by a man clearly still suffering the delusions his illness has always produced, aided by a physician desperate to shift blame for his own incompetence. "Then you'll have no objection," Justice Kemp said from the bench, his voice cutting through the rising tension of the chamber, "to a full and formal investigation, Lord Ellery, examining the estate's finances, the physician's records, and the testimony of any witness who can speak to the true nature of your guardianship these past 2 years. Given the severity of the accusation, I intend to pursue exactly that, regardless of your objection." Bertram's eyes swept the chamber, calculating, searching perhaps for some remaining avenue of escape, and found none. The crowd's murmuring had grown steadily more hostile as Julian's account and Halden's testimony settled into the gathered understanding. Years of quiet rumor about the tragic, isolated young duke, suddenly reframed entirely as evidence of a calculated crime, rather than simple misfortune. "This is not finished," Bertram said finally, his voice low and cold, meant only for Julian, though it carried further than he perhaps intended. "You may have survived this particular attempt, nephew, but you will find reclaiming what you believe is rightfully yours considerably more difficult than simply appearing before a country magistrate with a farmer's daughter as your only true witness." "I have considerably more than a single witness now, Uncle," Julian said quietly, "and I intend to see this through to its proper end, whatever difficulty you choose to place in the path." The formal investigation that followed took weeks rather than days, examining estate records and physicians' accounts with careful, methodical thoroughness that left little room for the kind of denial Bertram had initially attempted. Dr. Halden's testimony, corroborated by financial records showing payments that made little sense beyond the exact deception he described, proved impossible to dismiss as mere delusion or convenient fabrication. Neil Sanders testified as well, describing the conditions of Julian's confinement, the controlled letters, the escape, and its violent aftermath, his own beaten, battered body offering evidence that words alone could never fully convey. And when investigators finally traced the payment intended for the false body Bertram had attempted to purchase, tracing it through a chain of increasingly reluctant intermediaries back to the Earl's own private accounts, the last remaining doubt among even the most skeptical observers finally collapsed entirely. Bertram Ellery was stripped of his guardianship, his considerable holdings seized pending further legal proceedings regarding the attempted murder of his own nephew, and removed from Camden Hall under guard. The same grand halls he had governed with false authority for 2 years now closed to him entirely. Julian Rourke, Duke of Camden, stood before Justice Kemp on a bright winter morning, formally reclaiming the title and estate that had rightfully been his all along, his voice steady, with a confidence that had grown steadily throughout the ordeal, from a wounded, hunted man bleeding in a farmer's cellar, to a rightful duke reclaiming everything that had been stolen from him. Marian stood in the crowd of witnesses that day, watching him take that final, official step into the life he had been denied for 2 long years, and felt a complicated tangle of pride and quiet, aching uncertainty settle into her chest. He had his estate now, his title, his rightful place among the great families of the county, and she was still simply Marian Chase, a farmer's daughter with debts and a young brother to raise and a small holding that would never come close to matching the grandeur of Camden Hall. Whatever had grown between them in that small candlelit cellar, however real it had felt in the desperate intimacy of shared danger, she understood that the world beyond that cellar operated by different rules entirely, rules that rarely permitted a duke and a farmer's daughter to walk forward together once the crisis that bound them had finally passed. She turned to leave before the ceremony's formal celebrations could begin, telling herself it was simply practical, that Colin needed her home, that her presence among the county's gathered nobility would only invite the kind of awkward, pitying attention she had no wish to endure. But before she had gone more than a few steps, a familiar voice called her name across the crowded courtyard, steady and unmistakable despite the noise of celebration surrounding them both. Marian. She turned to find Julian moving through the crowd toward her, his fine new coat and restored bearing a far cry from the bloodied, broken man she had dragged through her cottage door weeks before. And yet his gray eyes held exactly the same warmth, exactly the same fierce, focused attention, as they had every night in that small, candle-lit cellar. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I only meant to slip away quietly. This is your day. You needn't trouble yourself over." "Marian," he said again, closing the distance between them entirely, ignoring the curious glances of the gathered crowd around them. "I did not survive 2 years of my uncle's cruelty, and a night bleeding in the frost, and every desperate risk we've taken these past weeks, only to let you walk away from me now that the danger has finally passed. You have an entire life waiting for you now," Marian said, her voice unsteady, despite her best efforts. "An estate, a title, expectations I could never possibly meet. I have a life," Julian agreed, "that I fully intend to build with the one person who chose to risk everything for me, before she ever knew what title I carried, who cared for my wounds and challenged my fears, and stood beside me through every moment of danger, without once asking what she might gain from doing so." He took her hand, gently, the same gesture that had steadied them both in the terrifying aftermath of Pike's near discovery weeks before. "I do not want the version of my life that excludes you, Marian Chase. Whatever expectations the world holds for a duke, I find I care considerably less for them than I do for the simple truth of what I feel for you." Marian's breath caught, hope and disbelief tangling together in her chest, as she searched his face for any hint of doubt, and found none at all, only the same steady, unwavering certainty that had carried them both through every danger since that first terrible night. Julian, she whispered, his name feeling entirely natural on her tongue after so many weeks of quiet, candlelit conversation. Are you certain? This is no small thing you're proposing. I have never been more certain of anything, he said, not even my own name, in all the confusion of these past 2 years. A small, warm smile touched his mouth, the same smile she had first glimpsed in the depths of her cellar, weak and fevered but unmistakably genuine. Marry me, Marion. Let us build whatever life comes next together, properly, without cellars or hiding or fear standing between us. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing the significance of the moment even without hearing every word, and Marion felt the weight of countless curious eyes upon them. The enormous, impossible gulf between a duke and a farmer's daughter suddenly rendered small and insignificant, beside the simple, overwhelming truth of what she felt for him. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, Julian, I will. The crowd's quiet gave way to a swell of surprised, delighted murmuring, as Julian pulled her close, and for the first time since that desperate, frozen night weeks before, Marion Chase felt no fear at all. Only the warm, certain promise of everything still to come. A full year had passed since Marion Chase first dragged a bleeding stranger through her cottage door, and standing now in the great hall of Camden Hall, watching sunlight pour through tall windows onto polished floors she had once believed existed only in stories told at the village market, she found it difficult to remember the woman she had been before that terrible, transformative night. The wedding had taken place in early spring, a smaller affair than many expected from a duke's marriage, held in the very village church where Marion had worshipped her entire life, surrounded by neighbors and farmers rather than the distant nobility Julian might once have been expected to invite. He had insisted on it, understanding perhaps better than anyone the value of the humble, honest world Marion had come from, refusing to let their marriage become simply another display of aristocratic tradition divorced from the genuine love that had grown between them. Colin had thrived in the months since, his sharp mind finally given proper opportunity through the tutors Julian arranged, though he still insisted on spending his summers helping with the small farm Marion had refused to sell, keeping it instead as a quiet retreat from the grandeur of Camden Hall, a reminder of where their story had truly begun. Neil Sanders now served as steward of the entire estate, trusted absolutely after everything he had risked to see Julian safely restored to his rightful place, and Dr. Halden, having faced no formal charges given his eventual honest testimony, continued his practice in the county seat, though Marion suspected he treated his patients now with considerably more genuine care than the fear-driven compliance that had once governed his choices under Bertram's threats. Bertram Ellery himself remained imprisoned, his trial concluded with a conviction that left no room for the kind of quiet influence he had once wielded so effectively, his considerable personal fortune seized to compensate the estate for 2 years of calculated damage. Marion rarely thought of him now, though occasionally, in quiet moments, she remembered the cold certainty in Julian's voice that first night in the cellar, his warning that whatever danger she imagined, the truth was considerably worse. She had not truly understood, that first terrified night, exactly how far that danger would reach, or exactly how deeply it would change the course of her own quiet life. But standing now in the warm afternoon light of the home she had never imagined belonging to, her hand resting gently on the curve of her own growing belly, the promise of a child who would never know the fear and danger that had brought its parents together, Marion understood something else entirely. Every risk, every terrified night, every desperate gamble taken in that small candle-lit cellar, had led exactly here, to a warmth and certainty she had never dared imagine possible for a farmer's daughter with nothing but debts and stubborn conscience to her name. Julian found her there, in the tall window's afternoon light, and crossed the hall to stand beside her, his hand covering hers where it rested against the gentle swell of their unborn child, his gray eyes holding the same steady warmth they had carried since that first terrible night she pulled him from the frost. "You're thinking of the cellar again," he said softly, knowing her thoughts even without her speaking them aloud, a familiarity built through months of quiet, honest conversation that had never truly stopped since that first desperate night. "I am," Marion admitted, leaning into him. "It seems impossible sometimes that we ended up here, given how it began." "Not impossible," Julian said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Only proof of what I told you that very first night, when you insisted on saving a stranger's life against every sensible instinct warning you otherwise. You are either very brave or very foolish, Marion Chase." "Rourke," she corrected softly, a warm smile touching her lips. "Marion Rourke, now, if you recall." "Marion Rourke," he agreed, his voice thick with quiet affection. "Duchess of Camden, and the single bravest, most foolish, most wonderful decision I have ever had the good fortune to witness. Outside, beyond the tall windows of the great hall, spring had settled fully over the Camden estate, green and warm and utterly at peace, a world away from the frozen, terrified night that had first brought them together. And as Marian stood there, wrapped in her husband's arms, feeling the quiet promise of the life still growing within her, she understood at last that every difficult, dangerous choice she had made in that small farmhouse cellar had led her, against every reasonable expectation, exactly where she was always meant to be. 2 years after the trial that stripped Bertram Ellery of his title and his freedom, a letter arrived at Camden Hall bearing a seal Marian did not recognize, and something in the careful, formal handwriting of the address made her stomach tighten with old, familiar unease before she had even broken the wax. She found Julian in his study, reviewing accounts with Neil Sanders at his side, and the two men looked up sharply at the expression on her face as she entered. "What is it?" Julian asked, rising immediately. "A letter," Marian said, holding it out. "From the prison where your uncle is held. I don't recognize the hand, but the seal marks it as official correspondence from the warden's office." Julian took the letter with visibly steady hands, though Marian could see the tension gathering in his shoulders as he broke the seal and read. Neil watched in silence, his own expression wary, old memories of beatings and locked grain stores clearly surfacing at the mere mention of anything connected to Bertram Ellery. "He's dying," Julian said finally, lowering the letter. "A fever that's taken hold in the prison these past weeks. The same illness that's claimed 2 other inmates already. The warden writes that he's asked, repeatedly, to see me before the end." The room fell silent, the weight of the request settling heavily over all 3 of them. Marian watched her husband's face carefully, searching for some sign of what he felt beneath the careful composure he had learned to maintain, even now, when speaking of the man who had once tried so thoroughly to destroy him. "You don't have to go," she said quietly. "Whatever he wants from this final meeting, you owe him nothing, Julian. Not after everything." "I know," Julian said, though his voice carried a complicated weight that told her the decision was not so simple as owing or not owing. "And yet I find myself wondering what 2 years of confinement and now the certainty of death might have changed in a man who once seemed to believe so completely in his own justification." "And if nothing has changed," Neil asked carefully, "if he simply means to torment you one final time before he goes, the way he tormented you for 2 years prior?" "Then I will have lost nothing beyond a single uncomfortable afternoon," Julian said, "and gained the certainty of having faced him honestly, one final time, rather than always wondering what might have been said." Marian understood, watching the resolve settle over her husband's face, that this was a decision he needed to make for himself, a final reckoning with the man who had shaped so much of his suffering, and she would not stand in the way of whatever peace or closure he hoped to find in it. "Then I'll come with you," she said simply. "Not into the cell itself, if you'd rather face him alone. But I won't have you making that journey without someone beside you who remembers exactly what he cost you." Julian's expression softened, gratitude and love plain in his gray eyes. "I would like that," he said, "more than I can properly say." The journey to the prison took the better part of 2 days, and Marian watched her husband grow steadily quieter as the distance closed, old memories clearly surfacing with each passing mile. Memories of isolation and false treatments and a night bleeding in the frozen woods that had nearly ended everything before it truly began. When they finally arrived, the warden led Julian alone through the cold stone corridors toward his uncle's cell, and Marian waited in a small antechamber, her heart aching for the man she loved as he faced this final, difficult reckoning. He returned nearly an hour later, his face pale but composed, and Marian rose immediately, searching his expression for some sign of how the meeting had gone. "He apologized," Julian said quietly, settling into the chair beside her, still visibly processing whatever had passed between them. "Not fully, not in the way that might have truly eased 2 years of suffering, but enough, I think, to be genuine, rather than merely convenient. He spoke of ambition that grew beyond reason, of convincing himself over time that the estate would be better managed under his own hand, that the deception was somehow justified by results rather than simple, ordinary greed." "Do you believe him?" Marian asked gently. "I believe," Julian said slowly, "that a dying man rarely has reason left to lie about the shape of his own regret. Whether that regret came too late to matter, whether it changes anything at all about what he did, I cannot say with certainty. But I find, having faced him one final time, that I no longer carry the same weight of unanswered anger I've held these past 2 years. Whatever happens now, whatever remains of his life, I have said what needed saying, and heard what he needed to say in return." Marion took his hand, understanding the quiet, complicated peace settling over him. A peace that had nothing to do with forgiveness in any simple sense, and everything to do with finally closing a chapter that had shaped so much of his life against his will. Bertram Ellery died 3 weeks later, and Julian attended the modest burial arranged by the prison, standing at a respectful distance from the small gathering of guards and officials who witnessed the end of a man whose ambition had once nearly cost his nephew everything. Marion stood beside him throughout, her hand steady in his, and when it was finished, they returned to Camden Hall together, to the life they had built from the wreckage of that terrible scheme, to a home filled now with warmth and laughter, rather than the cold, calculating silence that had once governed its halls. Their daughter had been born the previous autumn, a sharp-eyed, stubborn child who Julian swore carried her mother's fierce, unyielding conscience even in her earliest days, and Colin, now grown into a thoughtful young man pursuing his studies with the same quiet determination that had once helped drag a bleeding duke across a frozen yard, visited often, filling the halls of Camden Hall with a warmth that Marion suspected the old house had rarely known in all its grand, formal history. On quiet evenings, when the demands of the estate finally eased and their daughter had been settled for the night, Marion and Julian sometimes found themselves in the small, informal parlor they had claimed as their own, far removed from the grand formality of the rest of the house, and talked, as they always had, of everything and nothing, the same easy honesty that had first grown between them, in the candlelit dark of a farmhouse cellar. "Do you ever wonder," Marion asked one such evening, watching the fire crackle in the modest hearth, "what would have happened if I had simply walked past you that night, if I had told myself it wasn't my concern, and gone back inside without ever looking closer?" "Often," Julian admitted, pulling her closer against his side. "I would have died in that frost, almost certainly, within hours of when you found me. My uncle's men would have discovered my body eventually, and the story of my unfortunate accident would have been accepted without question, given how thoroughly he had already prepared the ground for exactly that outcome. And instead," Marion said softly, "here we are." "Here we are," Julian agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her hair, the fire's warm light dancing across both their faces, because a farmer's daughter, with more conscience than sense, refused to walk past a dying stranger, whatever the cost to her own safety. "I have spent every day since trying to prove myself worthy of that choice, Marion, and I suspect I will spend every remaining day of my life continuing that same effort." "You've already proven it," Marion said, turning in his arms to meet his eyes, warm and certain and utterly without the fear that had once governed every quiet moment they shared. "Every single day since, in every way that matters." Outside, the Camden estate settled into its familiar evening quiet, green fields stretching toward distant hills under a sky finally free of the danger and pursuit that had once haunted every corner of their lives. And within the warm, firelit parlor, Marion Rourke, once simply Marion Chase of a small, struggling farm, rested against the man she had pulled from the frost, with nothing more than a lantern and a stubborn, unshakable conscience, and felt, at long last, entirely and completely at peace.